Welcome to Foundations of Data Visualization Theory and Techniques. My name is Jordan Packer, and I am a senior data analyst at Columbia University Libraries. So today's session is going to really start with introducing these fundamental concepts and techniques for visualizing both qualitative and quantitative data. So I'm going to cover different visualization methods, including charts, graphs, infographics, and discuss how these tools can enhance data storytelling, which ultimately can support decision making and really create meaningful representations of your data visually. And like Mary said, this is part one of a two-part series. So today is really about these visualization methods, and part two is applying those techniques and designing your own library data visualizations and coming together to share those and workshop them together. So here are today's learning outcomes. Understand key principles of effective data visualization, recognize and differentiate between various visualization types and their best uses for qualitative and quantitative data, and to assess the effectiveness of different visualization methods in communicating complex library data and insights. All right, yeah, so my name's Jordan Packer, and like I said, I'm the senior data analyst for the assessment program at Columbia University Libraries, where we do all kinds of different assessment and analytics projects, and really work with colleagues in different departments to do their own assessment projects as well. And in addition to that, I'm a part-time faculty member at the Parsons School of Design, and I've taught information visualization, and I'm currently teaching the politics and ethics of design. And so I'm going to pull a little bit from both of those roles today to talk about visualization. So here is a really brief agenda of what we're going to work through today. Why is visualizing library data important? Some principles of data visualization, data storytelling, a lot of examples from my work and my students' work, and then key takeaways. So why is visualizing library data important? I'm sure you also agree that it's important since you're here in this call. But libraries use data collection to address a lot of different practical challenges and guide decision making, and also to advocate for support in a lot of ways. And with this newfound growth of data and technology in the last half century, we have so much more data visualization that's possible. And so by really successfully visualizing data, we have the power to communicate really effectively. And this can inform our decisions, enrich our understanding of systems, and just communicate more clearly with our whole community. So data visualization really is a medium that's transforming these very complex data into a visual format that can make the information easier to understand. And so the goal here is to uncover patterns and trends and use human visual perception to make it a little bit easier to identify those trends. So we really want to be simplifying data to make these insights very clear and accessible. So when you're starting out, it's really important to think through, what do you want to visualize, for what purpose, and for what audience? Because the visuals you will make will really vary depending on how you answer those questions. So I love this visualization that shows all of the different parts that come together to create a good data visualization. So here we see information, story, the goal, and visual metaphor all kind of coming together to create a very successful visualization. And this is from the book Knowledge is Beautiful. And you can really see this coming together of information, visualization, and design, journalism, and libraries really are at the heart of that here as well. So how do we get there? How do we get to the visualization stage? So this comes at the end of a long process of data organization, right? So first, you have to actually have the data. Typically, these are observations. This is the initial data collection. And because we're talking about data so broadly here, I've kept all of these definitions very vague, but depending on your own data collection, the observations will be different and take a different form. But this is where these actions or measurements are really recorded and you have this base. Um, then, those observations become this raw data, and that's the unprocessed, unorganized data that's very messy, usually, in a lot of different formats. You can't really make sense of it on its own. Then you organize the data, right? And that data is cleaned, structured, formatted into tables or databases that makes it easier to analyze. So things like removing duplicates, correcting errors, categorizing. And then finally, we get to visualize data. So this is the fourth step in this long process that we're really focusing on today. And this is when you take that organized data and create charts, graphs, and other visual formats to make these patterns and trends really clear. So today we're focusing just on this visualization aspect and running with the assumption that these other phases of data collection and cleaning are done ahead of time. So here are the key principles of data visualization. The first is to know your audience. The second is to foreground accessibility and inclusivity. The third is to use context to define purpose. Four, simplify. Five, use appropriate visualizations. And six, be intentional and consistent with design. So I'm going to go through each of these and spend some time working through what this actually means. So know your audience. So who do you want to share this visualization with? What is their knowledge base? Making a visualization for colleagues, for senior leadership at your institution, for the community, all of those will look different. And all of those people have different knowledge bases, right? So it really, the language you use will be determined by who this base is that you're trying to communicate with. And how will they read your information design? Is it someone that hasn't been to your library before, hasn't used this data source before? We have a lot of acronyms in the library world. Are those acronyms readable? Those sorts of things are really important to think about. And how do you anticipate they will interpret and use this data as a result? What is the purpose of sharing this data? So it's really important to consider audience expertise. So adapting your visualization based on your audience's knowledge base, but also considering how the data will be used. What's the purpose of this data, right? Is it advocacy? Is it communication? Is it improvement, strategic planning? Is it just curiosity? All of those purposes will be really essential in figuring out the best way to communicate the information and what you ultimately want to do with this visualization. And here I have a couple resources that are really helpful in thinking through your audience. So I recommend checking those out as well. So the next one is foregrounding accessibility and inclusivity. And this is designing for maximum inclusivity and accessibility, right? So there are a lot of different design choices we can make that make our visualizations accessible to more people. And I've included some here, and there's certainly more. One of the biggest things is color. Using color schemes that are colorblind friendly is a really good choice. But additionally, not relying on color to communicate information because there's so many spectrums of color blindness that relying on a certain definition of colors can be a problem. So I actually just went to the library assessment conference, and one of the talks there was talking about or it was a workshop, and this workshop was talking about using pattern fill instead of color, because that is something that's more accessible to a larger group of people. So thinking through choices like that as well. And then also using contrasting colors. Don't use colors that are so similar that even if you are not colorblind, you can't really see the difference. So color is something to use really purposefully, but not to overuse. And then font and text size. It's so simple, but making sure that your font is readable and is clear. And sans serif fonts are often easier to read, which is like the one I'm using here. And just making sure that your text is large enough. If you're doing a poster, the text needs to be larger. If you're doing something that's on a computer, sometimes those colors are a little bit different. So thinking through what platform this data viz will be shared on as well is really important. And then alt text and descriptions, make sure you're including really descriptive labels and alt text for all images and graphs. And for these alt text for graphs, it can be really helpful to describe the trends. So that's part of that alt text is describing sort of a summary of what the table is showing. And that's something that can be really helpful in general to start including in your data visualizations, and is something I'm striving to do more of, to include a short summary that explains what you see when you're looking at this visual yourself. Um, and then I have some resources here for posters specifically that show the best ways to design a poster for a conference. And these are resources that were shared for the library assessment conference that I found very helpful in creating something that is not a traditional size that you might be used to using. So next is using context to define purpose. So this is really placing your data in the broader context of what this data means. So it's important to frame your data, provide background information or other context around how this data is collected, why it's collected, and really creating a good entry point. If someone has no familiarity with what you're showing, provide enough detail that they could figure it out, and understand generally what you're getting at. It can also be helpful to show comparative metrics. So maybe there are other benchmarks, trends, other institutions you want to compare yourselves to. It can be helpful just to kind of place your own library, your own, you know, statistics within a broader conversation and to put in other data points that way. Um, One of my favorite ways to add context is to use annotations or captions within a visual to really explain key takeaways, or clarify complex points. So sometimes, you'll have a graph, and I'll show an example of this in a little bit, but you'll have a graph where, one point is a huge outlier. It's so different from the other points. It can be really helpful to just add a little annotation to that data point saying, this number is higher because X, Y, and Z happened this year. So if you have really clear reasons why, there's a data spike, or, during COVID, maybe there's a dip in your data, it can be really helpful to add a little annotation to those to really clearly illustrate that story. And then finally, narrative. Tying this data into a story with a clear message is really helpful for presenting the data more completely and really showing like why this is important, the broader context that matters. Why do we care about this data at all? What does this mean for us? The next principle is to really simplify. It's so easy to put too many things in a data visualization. It's really tempting if you have a great data set with so much information to try to create a visual that has everything in it. It's better to create multiple visualizations that are each simple. So I would always encourage you to reduce and try to create something that's very straightforward and just make more of them than to try to put everything in one. So remove clutter, minimize all of the non-essential elements like grid lines, excessive labels if they're, really a lot, although I personally like labels, so that's something to find your own balance with. And background colors can sometimes be distracting. Focus on just key insights. So like I was saying, only include the data that really helps the audience understand this key message in one visual. And if there's another key message, create another visual to communicate that. Reduce cognitive load. When I was first learning about data visualization, someone told me you want your visualization to be understandable within 5 seconds. So someone sees it and they have 5 seconds to understand the gist of what you're getting at. Um, and I think that guideline has been really helpful for me. So use really clean, straightforward visuals that are easy to interpret just in one glance. And you can test yourself too, make a visual, show someone, time them, and then say, what did you take away from that? It can be a really helpful test to see if you're communicating well. Um, and then finally, more of a design principle, think about the hierarchy of information, right? So make the important data stand out with a bold font, a different color or saturation or placement, and make sure that your titles are larger than your captions, and just the organization is in a way that it's clear for the eye to move through, and it makes sense what is the most important piece of information. So, something we're going to talk about a little bit in detail is using appropriate visualizations. So, it's really important to match your chart or visual to your data, which means that you're choosing a visualization that really works with the type of data that you have. Um, and I'm going to show some examples of what I mean by that and how to think about that. It's also important to really avoid these like misleading visuals. So make sure that your axes are appropriately scaled and you're not distorting the data to look like, wow, there's a huge change when really it's only, a couple points of difference that's been distorted. Um, Clarity and function. It's important to prioritize clarity over aesthetics. And I think sometimes the aesthetic goals come first, especially in design. And it's important to be balancing those and to be prioritizing clarity when possible. Um, and then finally, I love to experiment with different types of visualizations. I think that different visuals can offer different insights, and it's best practice to test a few and see what works best, what's the most readable, what actually communicates your information. So I don't consider this like a one and done. I really often try out a handful of different visuals and see if they're communicating the data the way that I would like it to. So here are some examples, right? So these titles, composition, comparison, relationship, and distribution, are different types of data trends that you're trying to show. So in composition, you're trying to show a part of a whole. And so these are some examples: a pie chart, a stacked column chart, a stacked area chart that get at that show composition. Comparison is where you're trying to show the difference between different categories. So those are different visuals than you would use for composition, right? So a column chart, a bar chart, a line chart, a radar chart, those are all for comparison. And then we have our relationship and distribution ones, which are more about two pieces interacting with each other. A scatter plot and a bubble chart, which is a scatter plot with one more piece of information. These are ways that you can show that relationship. So this is really just the beginning of thinking through, okay, what is the data that you have? Are you comparing groups? Are you comparing, is it a part of a whole that you're trying to represent? And this can help you guide about which visual to look at. So I have this really cool flow chart that I like, and it can be helpful if you're trying to think through what visual works best for you. Here, what would you like to show? Let's say, you want to show a comparison, then you can think through, is it among items or is it over time? And then if it's over time, is it many periods or is it few? Right. And so this can help you, at least in the ideation stage, to think through what are the best options for the trend I'm trying to show. And again, I would totally encourage experimenting. And maybe you try a line chart and it just isn't very compelling. You can try something else. And I think it's good practice to just try different things and see what sticks. And then I also have this visual, which is really helpful about different visualizations to choose. And sometimes, it's really a single number that's important. It's not something that needs to be visualized. And I love here how they've said, if it's a single number that's important, you can just have a large percent. Um, and that's something I'm a huge advocate for. It doesn't have to be a visualization. If it's going to be clearer to just have a large number, then you should do that. And here, there are other options as well if it's a single number that's important, like a pie chart, a bar or column chart, and this icon array is pretty cool. And then there are other categories here too that are interesting to think about. So if you want to show how two or more numbers are alike or not, um, how we're better or not than a benchmark, um, what the survey says, parts of a whole. Yeah, I love this. Don't visualize. Sometimes it's not right to visualize parts of a whole. Pie charts can become really, really hard to read when there's a lot of categories. And they're sort of infamous in the data viz community as something that should be avoided. So sometimes it's better to not use one. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about qualitative data as well. But when words have meaning, here are some ways that you can visualize that through heat maps, through having a picture and a quote, and through, there's a lot of different ways, and you can get pretty creative in that realm. And then, so there's this really cool Tableau public page that's on tutorials for how to do these visualizations. And so they have this collection of how-to videos and articles on all of these different visualizations. A lot of them are things I haven't even used. They're very unique and creative and cool, and also really fun to play around with and see if they speak to your data well. Okay, so the next principle is to be intentional and consistent with design. So, what I mean by that is coming up with your design language. And typically that means a consistency in colors, in fonts, in chart types, and just the visual language that you're using. So, not, throwing around colors randomly or fonts randomly, but really being purposeful in those decisions. Alignment and spacing, making sure that elements are aligned and evenly spaced. Purposeful color use, I've talked about that a bit. Just being very intentional when you do use color and knowing that color typically communicates something. So you shouldn't just use it randomly, which I have seen. And then visual balance, ensure the design is balanced. This means like not too much white space in one corner, that it feels even, it feels, you know, easy to move through and not overwhelming. It's not so crowded that it's, hard to understand what's happening. And that's where also simplifying comes in, that sometimes it can be better to have multiple visuals, and reduce the cognitive load of each one. So I want to talk about data storytelling and the way that we can really creatively visualize and humanize data. And I love this quote, which basically is, if you can't communicate data effectively, then the data you've analyzed isn't actually useful to anybody. So analyzing data should be seen as just the first step, but effective communication of that data is what makes it impactful. So there are a lot of different routes to go about data storytelling and really creative visualizing and humanizing of data. And here are some that I particularly like and that have worked for me, which is creating context, making your data relatable, using visual metaphors and cues, creating interactive dashboards, and illustrating the community impact. So I'm going to walk through some examples that hit on different aspects of those. And these examples I've pulled from a variety of sources and to me really show the ways that we can be creative in our visuals. So this is a very cool bar chart in National Geographic that is called plastic profusion. And I'm just going to read this description. Plastic waste, mostly from rivers or careless dumping on land, washes into the oceans at an average rate of about 9 million tons a year. The visible trash, along the heartbreaking images of its impact on everything from turtles to birds to whales, has generated a public outcry. But sunlight, wind, and waves eventually break down ocean plastic to bits that are barely visible. biggest unknowns and concerns is the effect of these microplastics, smaller than a fifth of an inch, might be having on fish. This graphic shows how critical the situation is in some parts of our seas, reaching the madness of more than 13,000 microplastics per gallon at Fromm Strait. So this visual is really creative because it takes the assumed boundaries of a chart and decides to play with them, right? So here we see there's so much plastic that the bar chart doesn't fit on the page and it starts to wrap around the entire page. And this is really powerful because it pushes against our expectation of what a bar chart should be and really emphasizes the volume. And I think it's powerful that they also use a straw here or a microplastic to create this visualization. Um, so yeah, that's why I am really drawn to this one. I think it's such a creative way to humanize the data and create an actual response of like, wow, that's a lot. That's so much more than I would have expected as it wraps around the page 2 times. So that's the first example. So the second example is oil spilled at sea. And this is also using the visual metaphor tactic. And so here we see, this is representing oil spills instead of using a traditional method through these drops of oil that fall down from the top of the visual. So here we see, the January 14th sinking of the tanker Sanchi was one of the worst oil shipping disasters in decades. 32 crew died in a tragedy that's tarnished the industry's gradually improving safety record. And here is a closer look at how Sanchi ranks among past tanker spills. So here, this is doing what I was talking about before of it's annotating these cases that you would be curious about. So when you're looking at this, if this didn't have an annotation here, it would be sort of confusing. Like when was this? What is this referring to? So the way that they've done that, I think, is really helpful and powerful. And then it also puts this the Sanchi disaster into perspective over here that it's actually not as bad as some of these other historic ones, but it's still quite bad. So again, this is a really interesting way of communicating this data and thinking about how can we make the impact of this data more powerful? How can we communicate what this data represents instead of just saying the numbers? So the New York Times is great at data visualizations, and they have a lot of different things. So I'm going to show a couple of examples from them. But one thing that they do really well are these sort of interactive data visualizations. So in this example, you can put in your own address and it will tell you what people call that neighborhood. Which is really interesting because a lot of the neighborhood boundaries are shifting as areas change or gentrify. There are new names for the neighborhood that pop up. And so, I chose this one area that's what I would probably call South Slope, but it's between, Park Slope and Sunset Park. And you can see what people call this area. And so this is a way, using interactive data is a way to really engage your audience because they can plug in their own address, the address of their friends, where they work, and it starts the conversation in a really interesting way of how this is immediately applicable to themselves. So yeah, this is a really cool visual and, not something that you may be able to do, but I think it's very inspiring in terms of its interactivity. So yeah, I encourage you to check this out and see what your neighborhood is referred to as. And then another thing that the New York Times is really good at are these articles that you scroll through. And as you scroll, the article kind of moves around, which is called scrolly telling. And this one in particular, I thought was really interesting. As you scroll through, it highlights different buildings and the way that this change in zoning has affected this one area. So here You see this residential building on the corner of 33rd Street and Fifth Avenue is one of 392 buildings in New York City that have a special agreement with the city. And then it kind of zooms in on this building. Before it was built, the city allowed the building's developers to add nearly 50,000 extra square feet to their plans, making it several stories taller than zoning rules would have ordinarily allowed. So that really clearly shows what they're talking about. In exchange for the extra space, the developers built an 82,000 square foot plaza next to the building that the owners were supposed to keep open to the public once construction was completed in 2005. So again, really clear outlining what's being discussed. And I encourage you to go to this article. It's a little bit more fun to scroll through. But city inspectors have often found the plaza was closed, even though the developers benefited from extra floor space worth millions. This 2016 Google Street View image shows it filled with construction materials. Inspectors issued a total of 4 violations between 2015 and 2021, noting that the gates were closed as they were in this image from July 2021. And then finally, they have more of a traditional data viz showing buildings with privately owned public spaces. And so here in orange are the ones with violations, and this like blue purple are without violations. And something cool about this map that I've been talking about a lot is the way they've annotated specific violations that have come up in these different areas. I think this visual is really good at the storytelling element. It makes it very compelling to walk through and understand what's happening in this area and how this area has been developed and what the situation is with these privately owned public spaces in New York. All right, so I want to pivot and show some examples from my information visualization class last year in fall 2023. This class was really fun. It incorporated a lot of different projects, and I'm going to show you examples from 2 of them. So the first project was a self-portrait, and I had students record data about themselves for about 2 weeks, and they were able to choose what they recorded about themselves and how they recorded it. And it could be either qualitative or quantitative data. It was totally open-ended. And the project asked for 3 visualizations that are in a poster format. So these are 2 of my students' work that I was particularly impressed by. On the left, we have my data visualizations that really shows music stats. So the top tracks and genres that she was listening to, and then the sort of beyond the genre, the feeling of the song. So danceability, energy, acousticness of that music. And then finally, she was saying that she often listens to music while she's walking. And so she wanted to compare her steps per day with this music that she's been listening to. So these are her 3 visualizations. And I thought it was very creative the way that she put in sort of her own handwriting and added these illustrations to bring all of this together since it's really personal data. And then on the right, we have how much does Lila read in a week? And all of her visuals were about reading. So it's a little hard to read here, but number of pages read per day is what this graph is. And I love that she made this in a book format. And really, it's handwritten. These are like stickers to show that like materiality. Percentage of the day spent reading. And then she has these pie charts for each day of the week. And then percent progress made through each book by day. And she has book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4. So big reader. And very fun to see these stats and the creative way that she put this together. So there were a wide variety of projects in this class that worked on this self-portrait theme. And I think that the ones that were most successful, like these ones, really leaned into what they were trying to communicate and had their own visual style. and really are cohesive. So this one on the right, it really is cohesive in this book format, and it feels very much like what she is talking about. So the second project I want to highlight are data sculptures, which was a challenging project for a lot of students, but I think it really pushed them. And the premise was to create a data visualization that is physical, and it had to be a physical object. But beyond that, I didn't have much criteria. I left it very open-ended purposefully. And so here on the left, we have women's tennis statistics, and this student used her own tennis racket to create these charts. And she said that, really often she feels like there aren't women's tennis statistics that are very available. And so she wanted to create this chart that would show these stats for all of these incredible women. And so you can see here percent of service games won, break point percent, etc. So really interesting idea to use your own tennis racket. And of course, very ephemeral. I think she had to take this apart pretty quickly to play tennis again, but very unique way to communicate the data. And then on the right, the busiest subway stations in New York City. So each of these blocks represent a subway station, and I don't believe I remember the exact ratio, but the more blocks, the busier the station is. This very tall one is Times Square. Over here, we have 34th Herald Square, and etc. So this was a really creative way to show the pure volume of use in some of these subway stations. And I really loved this project just because it worked so well at showing the amount of traffic these spaces get. And when you walked around, which you can't see very well in a picture, it had all of the trains listed that went through that station. And then I have one more actually, which is I also had students visualize interviews. And that's something that typically is not taught. And I, in my own education, felt like interviews often are not visualized. They're written up in reports, but there isn't really an attempt to visualize them in the same way. And I really liked kind of pushing students to try to visualize them. So here you can see like, this is about a saxophone player and really leaning on photos and other symbols and, putting together these different insights into a written form. And then another student for her qualitative visualization made sort of a magazine from a young stylist in New York City. And so she really leaned into the magazine format and wanted it to be a physical book in that way. So again, leaning into photos to show this interview visually. All right. So I'm going to go through some examples from libraries, and I want to save enough time for some questions at the end. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly here, but I do want to say these are examples from the Assessment and Analytics Department at Columbia University Libraries in collaboration with Nisa Bakalbasi, who is the Associate Director of the Assessment and Analytics Department. So here's an example of some data visualization. These are all of the libraries on Columbia University's campus. And you might not think of a map as data visualization, but it's actually really useful when we have so many different libraries in different areas to have them visually represented like this. So I made this map, and it's come up again and again in our reporting that it's helpful just to see where these libraries are located in relation to each other and the rest of campus. This is a page that I made for a report where we really walk through each of the different libraries we have and give some quick stats. And this was our at a glance page. And here I've taken out the stats, but you can see we have, all visits to this library. How many unique visitors do we have? How many seats and work surfaces? How many visits per seat? And just having that like really quick information has been helpful for a lot of directors and folks that are involved in each of these libraries to look at to have kind of that as a baseline. We've also made a number of heat maps. So these show the distribution of visits by month, hour, and day of the week. And we use conditional formatting to show the frequency of visits. So the darker the color, the more visits there are. And this is really striking just in showing, the saturation of visits that we have, especially in the afternoon in September and October, which makes sense as the term is heating up, more folks are entering the libraries. And then again, we see sort of a similar pattern in February, March, and April in the afternoons. Here we have simple pie charts and using a stacked bar chart. So again, it's really easy to overwhelm a pie chart. I try to keep it less than 4 categories in a pie chart. If it's going to be more than that, try something else is my suggestion. And so here we show the Morningside students and then all of the others, the medical center affiliates, non-students. And then of this percentage of students, where are they coming from? And so we have these different categories. These are different schools within Columbia. So keeping this really simple, but also pulling out additional data. We have some interactive dashboards that allow filtering by anyone. So in this dashboard, it's the same library swipe card data, and you can filter by library, by fiscal year, and by date. And this is something Tableau allows and is a little bit harder if you don't have Tableau, but can be done through a pivot table with other data. And having it so that you can filter based on your own setting is really helpful and does, in a less flashy way, the same thing that map the New York Times had of different neighborhoods does. And then finally, I want to talk about how to represent data when it's really hard to track. So something we're currently working on at Columbia is research and learning. And research and learning are functions of our library that are so critical and are often hard to track because these interactions may be impromptu or brief. And there's so many different routes of support, right? As I'm sure many of you have seen. So workshops, research consultations, orientation sessions, special collections visits, use of LibGuides. Those are all different forms of research and learning. And so we've really been talking a lot about how do we bring these things together to create, a more holistic view of what we're doing here. And we decided to highlight the breadth of our services by looking at 1 week in October. And by using this more qualitative approach of like, what is a week like in October, we're able to show the diverse sources of research and learning that all kind of come together in one of our busier months. So things like how many research consultations, reference interactions, and virtual chat references occurred, how many workshops were there, how many visits to the special collections are scheduled, how many page views do our LibGuides have. And so putting all of that together in a more qualitative way really humanizes what we're doing and tries to create, this image of what our library is like. I mean, it's a lot of moving pieces. The data's never going to be all uniform because we're doing so many different things in so many different areas. And so thinking through an approach that represents that and shows this breadth while also creating an image of what it's like at the library is one of our goals with this. And we're currently working on this project. So it's not complete yet, but this is our intent. So in sum, how can data visualization support decision making? They can really present this complex data in a clear, digestible format for faster understanding, highlighting key insights like patterns, trends, outliers, simplifying comparisons to help evaluate the options and risks, and enable decision makers to quickly grasp any critical data information. And finally, really facilitating data-driven, data-informed conclusions and, creating the appropriate action based on that. So, these are the takeaways. These are the data principles I went over: knowing your audience, foregrounding accessibility, using context to define purpose, simplifying, using appropriate visualizations, and being intentional with your design. And by implementing these principles, you can create really impactful, inclusive, and insightful data visualizations. So here I've listed quite a few free or low cost different tools that you can try using for data manipulation. Microsoft Excel, Google Sheets are what I use the most. Um, R and R Studio and Python are good if you have any coding experience. I have not used Data Wrangler, but it's been recommended to me. And then for visualization, there's really a lot that you can try: Google Sheets, Google Slides, Tableau Public, Google Data Studio, Canva. A lot of what I've made is in the Adobe suite, which is not free or low cost, but it is very good. And then finally, try drawing. These visuals do not need to be digital. We often over rely on digital. Try doing the data sculpture or try drawing out, the trends that you're noticing. Can be a really good way to get started. And also, it can be a good final product. It doesn't have to, be a flashy digital viz. And here's some really good sources of inspiration that I would encourage you to look through. The New York Times has these infographics of the year, and they've been doing that for a while, and they're really great to just poke around. The Data Visualization Society has incredible resources, and they also have the Nightingale Journal. Information is beautiful, material designs, data visualization. These Tufty books have been really helpful for me. And then there's more how-tos if you're looking for more technical support. So R for data science. Stack Overflow is great if you're trying to work through a data problem. Same with W3 Schools. And then YouTube and LinkedIn Learning have great resources too if you're running into problems and need some instruction. Yeah, so there's a part two to this where we will be able to really like talk through your own data visualizations. So I would encourage you to come to that if you're interested. And here are some of the questions you can be thinking about: brainstorming what type of library data you want to visualize, and try out some of the ideas from this session and bring them and we can talk them through. Yeah, so thank you so much. Here is my contact information. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And if you're interested in part two, I would encourage you to look at that slide and just be thinking about what kinds of visualizations you would want to bring next time. Thank you.